Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM, and coming with you now with the session recap for my campaign, The Sands of Calimare, for the week of December the. Oh boy, I think it was probably the 8th? So picking up where we left off, our party is currently split, and we dove back in with those currently within the obelisk. Having managed to survive their fight with the cultists and discovered a hidden wall leading to a stairwell up, the group doubled back, fearing that they might have alerted more cultists within the obelisk. They searched around carefully, and eventually deciding that they really don't want to trigger any more traps, and that's probably a good idea. So instead, they used Ryok. Ryok used his Channel Divinity ability, something he gained while earlier he spent time on Dakar, to summon a spectral raven. The raven, acting like Find Familiar, the spell, scouted out much of the first floor until it was destroyed by an odd looking, rotting creature quite far away from the party. Not wanting to fuck with that in their currently diminished state, they decided to double back, go with the traps they know, and head upstairs. They did a little exploring and found that this place was mostly barren of bodies. No cultists were here, no more weird rotted creatures. And they explored slowly. Ended up finding a few traps that did a little bit of damage to them, but nothing nearly as bad as the fight that happened on the first floor. During this time, Blair ended up finding a rather impressive looking set of leather armor, which they pocketed and put into their backpack. Exploring outward from there, they very carefully followed the paths, looking for traps and trying to avoid as much danger as possible. Eventually coming to a small room. Inside this room, an altar existed, with candles, books, and all sorts of things all around it. And floating at the top of the altar was this little 10-sided stone. It looked like smooth jade. Moores decided to go up and touch it, and after focusing on it for a moment, it started to bob its way up to his head and float around him. It was an ion stone. Uh, this is an ion stone a little bit different than the ones that are in the 5th edition source materials. I prefer just making my own and going with a looser following from Pathfinder, but that's just me. Not entirely relevant, as while Moores was playing with the stone and it was attuning to him, there was a flash of magical light, and Blair noticed that there was another hidden door in the room. But when Blair tried to push through it, it stayed closed. It was very clearly a door and not an illusion. They tried to figure out what had caused it, and discovered that when changing attunement with the Ion Stone, the flash it caused would show you where the door was. It would outline it pretty clearly. So, eventually, while just feeling it around, one of them decided to take the Ion Stone and press it against the door. There was a spark, and the stone's jade green form went dark gray, fell to the ground, and shattered. The door having robbed it of its magic, but it's serving as a potential lock for the wall itself. There was this hiss, a sudden intake of air, and the door pulled itself in and then slid up into the ceiling. And as it did, their eyes were accosted by this vicious red glow, crimson like blood, but neon bright. Remember, in the obelisk, the lighting right now is this low power but deep blue light that comes out of bands by the floor. Everything is just washed in deep blue. It's oversaturated as shit. It's like someone slapped a deep blue filter over the world. And suddenly this room is this brilliant, dark red, and it almost blinded some of them for a little bit. It took them back for sure. It really hurt their eyes. But then, inside all of that red, they noticed a body. Someone crouched on the ground, their body sort of leaned forward, and their hands pressed to the floor. Uh, Currently wrapped in this pyramid like cocoon of red runes. The runes that go up from the pyramid also go along the walls, spreading out to create these 12 tendrils along the floors and the ceilings and the walls that were generating this red light. But now that the door was open, the runes shivered and quaked and became almost like liquid and pulled their way back into the cocoon. And eventually, when it popped out, they saw a woman. A very pale looking elf woman with red scales on her shoulders and wearing a sort of uh, light blue nightgown over a simple top collapse. And that's where we come back to the other group. Kieran and Aesir attempted to pick up more information about what was going on with the different nobles at the dinner party to see who they could trust, while they all sat apart to eat their dessert. And they did not really pick up anything, to be honest. They both rolled pretty poorly and were more distracted with how delicious the dessert looked. Especially since Calimare, the city, tends to stay warmer during the night than the rest of the desert, thanks to the magic around it. It kind of stays at the same temperature. If it cools a little, but nowhere near as much as the cold in the desert does. And as everyone was finishing up their dessert, there was this great red flash, and everyone looked to the window, and this brilliant red beam of crackling energy sort of pulsed up along the pyramid and then shot straight into the sky, right as the other party had freed the woman. Uh, Realizing that shit has probably started to happen, uh, they all sort of panic, the two of them and Magnus. Neither of them noticing when Karen, the lead of the cultists, disappeared out of the room. Realizing after the fact that he was gone, the three of them went to leave. And Lord Zaken tried to stop Magnus, not wanting him to get involved with Karen's work, if for some reason Magnus would somehow get involved or stop the man. But no one in that room is in a position to tell Magnus anything, as he politically outranks all of them. Since instead of just being a duke, he's more like the son of a king. Not entirely, but in terms of political power, no duke in that room is going to tell Magnus what he can and can't do. Magnus, wanting to get the group there as fast as possible, talked his way out of Zaken's limp attempts to stop him, pulled the others into an alley, and used his ring of arming to swap his gear, switching out of his nobleman's clothes into his regular adventuring gear. And then spent one of his more unique magical items, which takes quite a while to recharge, to teleport them to a specific building that is designated within the city. And they ended up inside a brothel slash hookah den in the trade district, or sorry, the dens, I believe it's called, the trade dens, which had the two Kitsune very interested. And the name of the structure was Kubla Khan. They didn't ask why Magnus had a set up teleport point there and had a magical item that would take him there, so you don't get to know. But after seeing a fair amount of prostitutes and customers getting high, they left and realized they were only hundreds of feet away from the pyramid. So the pair of them moved forward to get a bit closer, ducking into the shadows, which is a residential district for the poor, who basically work as miners on the mountain itself, Shard, or who just do whatever the nobles tell them and take what little pay is offered. They hid in the shadows, waiting for some sign of what was to happen. Everyone else, feeling a loud pulse run through the pyramid as this happened, uh, knew they had to get out of here quickly because whatever it was probably going to attract attention. So Moores picked up the inert elf woman, and Grenier picked up Riok, who was still poisoned at this point because the poison lasted for about an hour. Though we were getting much closer to when the poison would wear off. And everyone just tried to run, hoping that they had discovered the thing that the cultists were after, or just wanting to get this woman away from them. They're not sure exactly what's going on, but they just knew that they're too weak to do much more exploring, and they now have someone who's unconscious with these large scars in her hand. They notice that the floor before where the woman was had a pair of spikes jutting out of it, and it looks like that her hands had been impaled on them. Uh, so they fled. They got all the way downstairs. Blair and Riok failing their second Constitution saving throw and getting quite winded, falling behind. Granier got to the door first and carefully looked out, using his bugbear innate ability to stealth to sort of just peek a view. It was at this point that Grenier noticed Cairn and his cultists approaching, giving orders outside. Uh, Grenier, knowing that Blair, Riok, and Moores were definitely not going to get away, as people were getting a lot closer to the mouth of the building, unless there was a real good distraction, decided to make one for them. Uh, Also, he had lost to this monk before, having fought him in Shangri Khan, and though he managed to do some pretty decent damage to the monk, he did lose the fight in like 2 rounds. It was a pretty explosive, kind of true duel, where they both landed about 1 round of blows, and Grenier's just wasn't enough to down the man. But the man's was definitely enough to take Grenier out at the time. Uh, No one else saw Cairn there, though. The other members of the Obelisk team. Only Grenier saw this. Grenier looked back and told everyone he would make a distraction, and then, entering into a rage, ran outside frothing, swinging his halberd, and charging towards Cairn. Partly out of a desire to give a reason for the party to escape, and partly because he was just pissed that he had lost to this bastard. Uh, the party used this moment to stealth away. Blair and Moores doing so quite successfully, but Rhea collapsed to the ground and ended up throwing up. However, with their aided stealth, they managed to get away. Grenier charged into the front of the cultists that were approaching and ended up killing about 5 of them. Just minions, swinging his large halberd around, killing them 2 at a time. Now that though the rest of the party wasn't quite there yet, everyone had leveled up to level 5. So I was giving Grenier his extra attack. Eventually, Karn called for the other cultists to stand aside, and excited at the thought of fighting Grenier again, the monk lock pulled his robe down to his waist like he'd done before, and pulled out his warlock rod and his monk artifact that he has wrapped around his left arm and struck his pose as he cast Armor of Agathis on himself. Uh, the temple group was watching this, panicking, trying to decide whether or not they should get involved, when they heard a voice call up from the side, telling them to get this way, and they looked up and saw Magnus pull out his crossbow, eject one of his wands, and drop 3 globes of darkness surrounding the corner of the obelisk, so it would block them even more from line of sight, in case someone from up on the hill might have looked this way. Uh, the 3 of them, now having a clear route out, ran up the hill and was pulled over the edge by Magnus, Kieran, and Aesir, and ducked into a nearby alleyway to receive some emergency healing. and restoration, curing Ryok of his poison. Uh, Magnus dispelled the darkness, not wanting to attract attention. And as they all did this, they got a view of the fight between Karen and Grenier. Grenier managed to do a lot more damage this time, and got Karen looking pretty close to death. But thanks to the armor of Agathis dealing damage that bypassed the level 5 barbarian's damage resistance, and the fire damage that came from using the monk artifact that was around his left arm, he was able to burst Grenier down in like 2 rounds. Uh, Again, the monk has not really the most hit points in the world because of his levels in Warlock, but like, you know, he he hits like a fucking Mack truck. So Grenier went down, and they were concerned, but the cultists were already tending to Grenier's wounds. Definitely looked like the Karen didn't want to kill him, probably because he just enjoys fighting the bugbear. Uh, and they were quickly tying him up and tending to his wounds. He began ordering people to enter the temple and figure out what had happened en masse. They had just recently breached the Obelisk and hadn't really sent a full exploration team in yet. It was something they were going to do later when they had a better plan and a better idea of what was inside. But now, the fact that Grenier was here and that Karen had seen Aesir and Kieran at the dinner, he had a feeling he knew what was going on and wanted to make sure they hadn't fucked his plans up. Which they did. Uh, as Kieran waited down below, Magnus closed his eyes and linked his senses with a Cath, his familiar, a fox. And a Cath skitter forward. Now, illusion, thanks to a disguise spell from Magnus, illusioned into this dark black fox and completely blending in with the early morning darkness of the city. Karen, one of the cultists came out and explained that they had run into a few things. Some very powerful avian zombie in the northern part of the first floor, or sorry, the southern part of the first floor, technically, and that it was giving them trouble, and that their troops had pulled back from that location. They discovered a lot more traps, and some of their men were pretty hurt, but they had discovered the way upstairs and discovered they believed the room they were looking for, but the cultist said that it was empty. Karen told him to go get more troops and to deal with the issues at hand and basically be more thorough, try to find any secret rooms. We're going to get as much out of here as we can. At which point, Karen walked away around the corner, closer to the shadow side. Though he didn't see them, the party could feel his eyes pass over them as they ducked in the alley, hiding like over 150 feet away up a hill. So they were like well out of sight, but they could still feel this presence passing over them. And then Karn started to talk to someone who wasn't there. Maybe someone only he could see. Someone he deferred to as master. And through the conversation, they heard that she was gone, that someone had taken her, but he had an idea of who they were. He apologized to this figure, this invisible, voiceless thing that a Cath couldn't perceive. He knew that she had what they were looking for, and was also their only ties to hunting down a man named Conan. And that he would find them, and that he had a good idea of who they were with, or where they were, and that he would be able to tap into scrying magic the next day to really find them if he had to. Over the course of this, they also picked up that this figure that he was speaking to has a son, and that the son had apparently bested some sort of dragon and captured it. Uh, they don't know necessarily what that means, but of course, as soon as anyone says the word dragon, Aesir starts freaking out and hyperventilating. Uh, Eventually, Karn finished his conversation with this master and went back to oversee the excavation of the first and second floors of the obelisk. And the party huddled together, just taking this all in, uh, wanted to get away. And Magnus used a pretty powerful infusion that cost him quite a bit to make, to teleport the whole group uh, to Galveston's Manor. They put the beds together in the room where Blair had been sleeping earlier, got some other smaller beds dragged into the room, and they all pushed them together into just one big pile. And exhausted, most of them went in and went to sleep. Aesir hadn't. He stayed up, and Magnus sort of sat at watch with his crossbow on his lap. Riok and Moors, however, ran off, realizing that they might need to get out of the city a lot sooner than they thought. They traveled back to the trade district and met with Estevan, Riok's cousin, and asked if there was any way they could get out of the city and get to Laputa, the city where Riok is from. His cousin thought about it for a moment and said he could try and get them there within 24 hours. The city was nearby, but it would need time to move if they were going to help. Uh, they would have to meet him around 1 in the morning the next day, uh, and hopefully the city would be close enough to aid. Satisfied that they had helped, or at least planned for a way to evacuate the city, especially now that Karen apparently knew that they had stolen something they wanted, everyone headed back, and once Riok and Moors were back in the room, Aesir also went to sleep. It was then that, after what felt like an eternity of darkness, there was this voice that called out to the elf woman. She heard this voice crying out for freedom, weak and almost broken, the clattering of chains. And then they saw someone they'd seen before, a dwarven woman with dark onyx-like skin and ash-gray hair, eyes of soft amber. And this dwarf woman who they'd seen before looked elated that they were there, that they could see each other and talk to each other. And the elf saw the hammer appear into her hand, and this dream space, her hammer, the ash hammer, this brilliant dwarven-made hammer that as it appears in her hand has ash run down the grooves of its shaft and the grooves of the head to sort of fall to the ground like a waterfall of ash. And the woman grabbed her shoulder, elated that they were here, they were back, we could finish the mission. And with the firm grip on her shoulder, the dwarf told her to wake up. And so she did. The elf woke up in a strange place, the sound of many people sleeping around her. Slowly she pulled herself up and stealthily started making her way across the room, spotting that a cat, this adorable little fox, who had reverted to its normal Arctic colors, was sitting on the back of a chair, sort of patrolling above this burly dwarf. Uh, and she spoke to it softly for a moment, and then went to the window as the the western side of the room, had this large outward-facing window. And from there she could see the obelisk and a bunch of buildings, the whole spread out of the city, quite a bit of it. Parts of the lake, the trade districts, and the obelisk. And the mountain of Shard, of course. But it all looked quite a bit different than she remembered. She started to panic a little bit, not really recognizing everything. She knew the obelisk and could tell that it looked the same, but everything else looked quite different. The buildings didn't look like they were made the same. and it was beginning to fill her with a bit of panic. As she turned back around, she noticed that Magnus was awake. A Cath, of course, being able to wake her master. And the fox had sort of followed the elf to the edge of the room, sitting on one of the posts of the bed that they were all in. The elf spoke to Magnus in a language that very few would understand, but Magnus had a rough idea of different words in the language, but he didn't speak it quite accurately. He sort of spoke with an accent, as if he didn't fully understand the grammar, which was interesting, since I was using Google Translate, and it often came up with things that grammatically didn't always feel right. Uh, Deciding that this elf probably wasn't a threat to them, he told the rest of the party to wake up, and they met this woman. Uh, they spoke for a little bit and exchanged names, and learned that her name was Nixandra. Uh, and she was quite ravished. She ravished, like, not ravished, starving, sorry. Famished was the word I was looking for. She had managed to sate a bit of her hunger earlier to stifle the groaning of her stomach with water that was nearby. But once they start bringing up food, she becomes like ravenous. And so Riok, who had forgot that he could, as his channel divinity, just summon a feast, went, "Oh yeah, I can make food," and summoned a bunch of food for the elf, who, though they tried to resist just devouring it, failed horribly, and just sort of went at it two-fist style. Uh, and once they had managed to eat, they spoke for a little bit, asking a few questions of each other, not really finding answers. Uh, the group was really awkward, just sort of saying random important plot things, but just kind of dropping them on the elf. Like, hey, there were these bad people who were looking for you, but we stole you from them. So, yeah, the enemy of our enemy is our friend, right? So, I mean, you should totally help us and stick with us, and we'll keep you safe from these people who are trying to do you harm. Just sort of like out of nowhere. It was just a little weird. Uh, it was like their characters didn't understand the proper flow of a conversation, which is fun because I'm sure that's exactly how those characters would have acted in real life. I'm looking at one of you in particular who I won't name because I don't need to. Uh, During all this confusion, the Magnus asked the elf in her own tongue uh, if she knew the year or what year was the last year she remembered, and she told them a very specific year. I think it was like 260 or something of the third age. In this setting, the years on the calendar are marked by a year, followed by the letter A to reference the age, and then the number for the age. So a typical thing to say would be 286A3. Would be the year 286 of the third age. It's how the calendar works for the Dralian Empire, which they are in. So they all take a moment and think about that for a second. Magnus, more so than the others, because he just has a better idea of the calendar. Uh, but 286A3, like, really shocked him. I don't think it was 286 exactly. I don't have in my notes right now available to me what year it was, but it was around 286A3, give or take. Uh, And Nick Sander was like, "Why? What year is it?" And Magnus told her that it was the year 85, A5. The year 85 of the fifth age. And because of the way the Dralian calendar works, it resets with each age. So unless you keep track of how long the previous age ran, you're not really going to know what year it is universally. Uh, but it quickly was explained that that was about 3,000 years later, which forced the elf into a bit of a panic attack. Uh, However, around this time, they expressed uh, information about what the cultists had said. How she had something they wanted, but they didn't know what it was, and that they were looking for someone named Conan, which was a big trigger for Alexandra because Conan was the name of her imaginary friend when she was young, someone who she would see and talk to, and just sort of watched over her on occasion, just sort of showing up this tall elf-looking figure with a heavy robe concealing most of his body. Uh, she called him Conan. She had no idea if that was his real name. He never spoke back to her, but he was like a watchful, haunting figure that was always around her when she was young. Just sort of coming and going randomly, never being seen by anyone else, so she always just assumed he was imaginary, and still does, as she's seen nothing to the contrary, but no one else ever knew about Conan. And so the fact that these cultists were referring to the figure by the name she gave it was very disconcerting to her. And something about a dragon, which she had no idea what that was about. Uh, so as this was happening, and they were all discussing their plan, they were going to leave the city and asked her if she would come with them. Uh, they would help try and keep her safe, figure out what happened to her family, help her figure out what's going on in the world now. But they'll do all of that, but we have to get you away from these people now because they're powerful and dangerous. And she agreed to go with them. Also, because this was a new PC coming in, a new player to the party, so it's kind of easier to move that part of the plot along with the person sitting next to you, unless your players are assholes. Uh, but Coop, who again is the beautiful artist that you see the picture of Nixandra for, and if you watch my other recaps, does the art for a lot of those. Coop, our delightful, delightful player, is piloting Nixandra, and thank you, Coop. We love you. Uh, at which point, uh, everything seemed to slow down for Nixandra. Everyone was excitedly talking about their plans for Laputa, the place they were going to travel to. No one really knows what that is besides Ryok, and no one was really asking questions. Magnus knows, but he's just more impressed that Ryok knows about Laputa and has a way to get there. And everything seemed to slow down, and a figure appeared across the room from Nixandra. This large, looming man with a very squared off jaw, bald head. Uh, Someone who the other people in the room would recognize, mostly Blair and Aesir as Aesir's father, who had oddly been visiting several people within the party scattered throughout this adventure in some sort of weird ethereal like shape. He spoke to Nixandra for a moment, curious as to her intentions and whether or not she would be traveling with his son. She said she would be, and he seemed to accept that after staring her down for a little bit. There was a moment where she did realize he was a dragon. He shed his human form, and the building sort of fell away as his colossal dragon form took over. I believe he is a bronze dragon. My notes, again, are far away from me. With upcoming holiday season, my stuff's a little scattered. Uh, but he vanished shortly after that, and she popped back out and didn't bring this up to anyone, that she had had this conversation with him. At which point, the party uh, got ready to leave. They had about a day and quite a bit of things they wanted to get done. Linnell, the butler for Lord Gavelson, had brought in a hefty sack of coin, about 10,000 gold worth of platinum, as thanks from the Lord Gavelston for interrupting the cultist plans. Uh, and because the party never really had access to money, this is the first time they've ever done anything and might have had a moment to get money. And sadly, they don't have very much time to spend it. Uh, it's not really my intention that everything keeps going so fast paced. It just sort of is the way things keep happening right now. I don't imagine this is going to last, and there will be times where there's a bit more peace, most likely in Laputa. But for now, everything still feels pretty fast paced. Uh, so they split up their gold and say goodbye to the Lord and Lady of the house, Lord Galveston and his twin sister. Uh, the conversation is brief, uh, but he tells them they always have a safe haven here, especially if they're continuing to fuck up these cultists' plans. Uh, he and his sister are both keeping a close eye on this new elf woman. They speak to her briefly, and it seems that they know something about her more than everyone else does, but they don't bring it up. And then the party left. And that was the end of the session. We're going to be opening next session with their, hopefully, a successful shopping spree. As I know several of them have some magical items and equipments that they want to procure with all this money they suddenly have. If you have any questions, comments, or inquiries about the setting, the world, the lore of specific characters, or questions for the players, please don't hesitate to ask me about them in the comments below. I'll try to answer any and all questions and comments any way I can. Thank you for coming by. Hit that subscribe button, give that like button a lick, and I'll see you all next time.